My first several summers in the Sierra I spent on my belly, sliding over the smooth granite of the upper Yosemite, tracing and charting the glacial striations, scratches left in the rock by the ancient glaciers as they carved out these tremendous landscapes. And though I saw abundant evidence of glaciers in the Sierra, I never did see a living glacier at work. So, in the summer of 1879 and 80, I set off for Alaska to put my feet on living ice and see new Yosemites being carved out before my eyes. My good friend Hall Young was waiting, with canoes ready and packed, and expert Indian guides standing by. When we were ready to launch off, Mr. Young came walking down the dock, followed by a strange little dog. Now, I like dogs, but this one seemed so useless I objected to its coming. "Man, surely you don't mean to bring a toy dog like that along on a trip like this?" "And why not?" "Well, we'll be out in the rain and snow for weeks and months. He'll catch his death of cold. We'll have to tend him like a baby." "Oh, no, John, you're wrong. You see before you a perfect wonder of a dog, John. He can endure cold and hunger like a bear, swim like a seal, and is wondrous wise and cunning." Well, he made out such a list of virtues as if this dog would be the most interesting member of the entire party. Mr. Young told me that the little fellow had been adopted by the Indians of these parts, who had named him with their very own tribal name, Stickeen. He was petted, protected, and regarded as a mysterious fountain of wisdom. While we were arguing over him, Stickeen hopped aboard and settled himself into the baggage. As we slid over the smooth water, and in the days to follow, in camp and in the woods, I watched Stickeen. Nobody could hope to unravel the lines of his ancestry. In all the wonderfully mixed and varied dog tribe, I never saw any creature very much like him, though in some of his sly, soft, gliding motions and gestures he brought the fox to mind. He was short-legged and bunchy-bodied, and his hair, though smooth, was long and silky and slightly waved. At first sight, his only noticeable feature was his fine tail, which was about as airy and shady as a squirrel's. As we paddled through the endless inlets and bays, Stickeen lay with his chin on the bow of the boat, gazing out on the tree-covered islands and up at the snowy mountains. Sometimes he would appear to doze for hours on end, but I discovered that somehow he always knew exactly what was going on, for if anyone mentioned making a landing, Stickeen immediately sprung to his feet to see what sort of a place we were coming to, and jumped overboard and swam ashore as soon as the canoe neared the beach. And with a vigorous shake to rid his hair of the brine, he ran into the woods to hunt small game. Though Stickeen was always the first out of the canoe, he was always the last one back in. When we were ready to start, we'd call and call, "Stickeen! Stickeen!" But he refused to come. I soon realized that though we could not see him, he could see us perfectly well all the while, peering out from between the briars and huckleberry bushes on the fringes of the woods. For as soon as we were fairly well off, he came trotting down the beach, plunged into the surf, and swam after us. We tried to cure him of this trick by paddling further and further distances, forcing him to swim a long ways. But it did no good. The longer the swim, the better he seemed to like it. When the little vagabond came alongside the canoe, we would grab him by the scruff of the neck, hold him for a moment to drip, swing him over and drop him into the boat. I soon learned that Stickeen was an adventurer. He took to following me on my daily excursions, wading and wallowing through snow, swimming icy streams, skipping over logs and rocks and the crevasses of glaciers. Stickeen seemed to meet danger and hardships without anything like reason. Ordinary storms were pleasures to him, and as for mere rain, why, he flourished in it like a vegetable. His evenness of temper was so steady, it seemed due to a want of feeling. Once, as we were crossing a glacier, I looked back to see that each of Stickeen's tracks were marked with blood. I picked him up and turned him over on his back and found that the sharp ice had cut and worn away the pads of his feet. So I fashioned him a set of moccasins out of a handkerchief I had in my pocket, and set him back upright. Well, he trotted along as steadily as before. Blood or no blood, shoes or no shoes, he was a mountaineer. Stickeen seemed to be as cold as a glacier, as unfeeling as a tree. He never wagged his tail, and never wanted to be petted. He never came when you called him, and he never obeyed an order. The hunters, they tried to get him to retrieve game, but Stickeen wasn't interested. Everyone began to wonder what good he was anyway. But his strength of character lay in his eyes. His eyes looked as old as the hills, and as young, and as wild. I never tired of looking into them. It was like looking into a landscape. One afternoon we came to camp at the base of the huge Taylor Glacier. We made our supper and went to bed, and in the morning I awoke early to the sound of a tremendous storm. I pushed open the flaps of the tent to see the rain flying in a passionate horizontal flood, as if passing over the land instead of falling on it. Streams were booming up out of their banks, and the lofty walls of the inlet and the ice cliffs were streaming with white cascades and falls. I quickly dressed and was out into the woods, for many of nature's finest lessons are to be found in her storms. Mr. Young and the Indians were asleep, and so I hoped was Stickeen. But I'd not gone more than a dozen rods before Stickeen leapt from his bed in the tent and came boring through the blast after me. "Stickeen, you must be daft! Go back to camp and keep warm and dry. Get a good breakfast with your master, and for once in your life, be sensible. I can't carry you all day, Stickeen, or feed you, and this storm will kill you." But Stickeen was not to be shaken off. I might as well have been the earth trying to get rid of the moon. So I reached into my pocket and pulled out a biscuit, the only food I had brought, broke it in half, and Stickeen and I shared a breakfast, a bread and a rain. And thus began the most memorable of all my wild days. Stickeen and I pushed our way through the woods as the level flood, driving hard in our faces, thrashed and washed us wildly. And the storm, with music from the leaves and branches and boles of the trees, and even the splintered rocks and ice crags overhead, sang as if each leaf and tree, crag and spire were a tuned reed. At last we climbed up to the surface of the glacier, and there, as far as the eye could see, the level ice river stretched away beneath the grey sky, a seemingly boundless prairie of ice. A sudden break in the clouds showed the forest on the far side, by which I judged the glacier was about 7 miles across. So we set off. The ice was smooth and even for several miles, but toward the west side we came to a section filled with crevasses. We had to make long, narrow tacks and doublings, tracing the edges of the tremendous crevasses, many of which were 20 feet wide and hundreds of feet deep, beautiful and awful. I was severely cautious, but Stickeen came on like a flying cloud. The widest crevasse that I could jump, he would leap across without so much as halting to take a look at it. The little adventurer was only about 2 years old, yet nothing seemed dangerous to him. He trotted bravely on as if glaciers were playgrounds. I kept warning him to be careful. "Look down there. If you fall in, that will be your grave, it will, and a cold one, too." We crossed the glacier and gained the woods on the west shore in about 3 hours. Then we pushed northward, upstream, in order to see as far back as possible into the fountains of the Fairweather Mountains as we could. In an hour or so we came suddenly on a branch of the glacier, a magnificent ice falls, 2 miles wide, pouring over the rim of the main basin. The surface of the ice, broken into wave-shaped blades and shattered blocks, resembled the wildest, heaving, plunging motion of a great river. But now the gathering clouds began to drop misty fringes, and soon the dreaded snow came flying thick and fast. Snow crystals, the flowers of the mountain clouds, are frail, beautiful things, but terrible when flying on storm winds in darkening, benumbing storms, or when welded together into glaciers full of deadly crevasses. I knew we must return to camp at once to avoid being trapped on the glacier in a snowstorm. So we set out immediately over the glacier until we had left the west shore far behind us. But here the ice was broken and tangled, a terrible confusing maze of crevasses and dislocated ice blocks. I pushed on as best I could, jumping innumerable crevasses, and for every 100 rods or so of direct advance, we travelled a mile, doubling back and forth, looking for places to cross. Stickeen showed no trace of fear, but I noticed he kept close by me in the storm darkness. At length we came upon a very wide and straight crevasse, which I traced rapidly northward a mile or so without finding a crossing, then down the crevasse about as far. In all this distance there was only one place where I could possibly jump it, but the width was the utmost I dared, about 8 feet, over thin air to the far rim, while the danger of slipping on that rim was so great that I was loath to try it. The side I was on was about a foot higher than the other side. If we jumped, we'd be breaking the first rule of mountaineers who live long. Don't go anywhere you can't get back from. We could jump down, but not back up. Oh, but the storm was growing thicker, and the night would soon be upon us. So, because of the dangers already behind us, I determined to venture against those that might be ahead. With the ice axe, I carved a foothold in the ice, placed my foot, gathered my strength, and leapt across. I landed well, but with precious little to spare. The Stickeen flashed across behind me, easy as the wind, and we ran eagerly ahead, hoping we were leaving all our troubles behind. But we'd gone little more than 100 yards when a sight met my eyes that froze my blood. An impossibly wide crevasse, easily 1,000 feet deep, and spanning this terrible chasm was a thin sliver bridge of ice, knife-edged, which stretched 70 feet from one ice wall to the other. I took one look and wanted to have nothing to do with it. I ran now, hoping against hope that this giant crevasse would narrow enough to a place where we could jump across. But I found, to my great dismay, that it met and joined the same crevasse we had just jumped across. Truly afraid now, I ran back along the edge, past the ice bridge. But the worst of my fears were confirmed, for here the crevasse again met and joined the same crevasse we had just jumped across. And the terrible truth sunk in. Stickeen and I were trapped on an island of ice, surrounded by a moat of air 1,000 feet deep. And there was no way off. No way but the ice bridge. I ran back now to the ice bridge and looked cautiously down at it through the swirling snow. We'd be compelled to climb down 10 feet of sheer ice cliff to reach the bridge at all. The knife edge of the ice drooped down in the middle like a suspension cable, rising to the far side and joining the cliff about 10 feet below the rim, and safety. Of the many perils encountered in my years of wandering on mountains and glaciers, none seemed so plain and stern and merciless as this one. And it was presented to us when we were wet to the skin and hungry, and the sky dark with quick driving snow, and the night near. But we were forced to face it. It was a tremendous necessity. With my ice axe, I cut a deep hollow in the ice, on the brink for my knees to rest in. Then, leaning over, I cut the first step below. While I was on my knees chipping, Stickeen trotted up behind me, pushing his head past my shoulder, and for the first time I saw the little dog look directly down into a crevasse. He peered down and across, scanning the ice bridge and its dangerous approaches with his mysterious eyes. Then he looked me in the face, muttering and whining, saying plainly, "Surely you're not thinking of going down there?" That Stickeen recognized the danger at the first glance was wonderful. Never before had the daring midget seemed to know that ice was slippery, or that there was anything in the world called danger. "Hush your fears, my boy," I said. "We will get across safe, though it's not going to be easy. There's no right way in this rough world. We must risk our lives to save them. At the worst, we can only slip. And then what a grand grave we'll have." But my sermon didn't reassure him much. He began to cry and ran away, seeking any other way of crossing. By the time he got back, baffled of course, I was clinging to the cliff wall, standing in the third step with a handhold in the first. When Stickeen saw me there, he cried aloud in despair. I continued to cut the steps very carefully, for life and death were in every stroke, and in the niceness of finish of every foothold. Step by step, I cut my way down the cliff. At last I reached the ice bridge, and let myself down safely astride the sliver. Then I set about chipping off the sharp edge with short, careful strokes of the ice axe, making a 4-inch wide walkway for Stickeen to cross, and hitching forward an inch or two at a time, keeping my balance with my knees pressed against the sides. The tremendous abyss on either side I studiously ignored. To me, the edge of that blue sliver was then all the world. Chipping away, and hitching forward inch by inch, I slowly crossed the bridge. But now came the most difficult challenge, to rise from the safe position astride the ice bridge and to cut a step-ladder in the nearly vertical face of the wall, chipping, climbing, holding on with feet and fingers in mere notches. At such times one's whole body is eye, and common skill and fortitude are replaced by power beyond our call or knowledge. At last I felt my fingers come up over the edge of the cliff, and I pulled myself up, safe, at last. But poor Stickeen, when I gained the other side, he screamed louder than ever. I looked across at him through the flying snow, a little spark of life and warmth in a world of ice and darkness. Stickeen ran back and forth in a vain search for a way of escape. Then he returned to the brink of the crevasse above the bridge, moaning and wailing as if in the bitterness of death. "Come on, lad, come on! You can do it! Faith, boy, faith!" But Stickeen only howled the louder. "Oh, what a place! No, I can never, ever go down there!" Was this my silent little philosopher? Strange so small an animal should be capable of such big, wise fears. Had the danger been less, his distress would have seemed ridiculous. But we both knew that in that merciless abyss lay the shadow of death. To get him to try, through fear of being abandoned, I started off into the storm, as if leaving him to his fate, and disappeared in back of an ice hummock. But this did no good. He only lay down and moaned in utter hopeless misery. So I went back to the brink of the crevasse, and in a severe voice shouted across to him, "Come on, Stickeen, come on! I cannot stay here longer. I must go. If you will not come, I must go. I'll come back for you tomorrow, Stickeen. Stay where you are. Don't go back to the woods. The wolves will eat you for their supper. I'll come back in the morning." He knew very well what I was saying, and suddenly a great change came over the little dog. He stopped his crying, and his tail came out from between his legs, and with the courage of despair, hushed and breathless, he crouched down on the brink, pressed his body against the ice as if holding on with every hair, and without lifting them, slid his little front feet slowly, slowly over the edge and down into the first step, and then his hind feet, over the edge and down into the same step, bunching all four together. Then he slowly worked his front feet down into the second step, and his back feet, and I watched through the swirling snow as step by step Stickeen descended down into the crevasse until he gained the ice bridge. Now he came forward, marching like a little soldier, holding himself steady against the gusty wind and giving separate attention to each little step. Slowly, slowly he came, and at last gained the foot of the cliff. Here he halted in dead silence and looked up into my eyes, and I looked down into his. "Good boy, brave boy." But in my mind I feared that all his courage might go to waste, for you know as well as I that dogs are poor climbers. And while I was thinking how I might make a cord out of my clothing to lasso around his head and pull him up, Stickeen's sharp eyes were looking keenly at the steps and notches, as if fixing the position and angle of each one of them in his mind. And then suddenly, before I could see how he did it, up he came in a springy rush, hooking his paws into the steps and notches, and whizzed past my head like a bullet, safe at last. And now came a scene. Well done, brave boy! I tried to catch him and caress him, but Stickeen would not be caught. He flashed and darted hither and thither as if fairly demented, screaming and shouting, swirling round and round in giddy loops and circles, turning somersaults sideways and head over heels, and pouring forth a tumultuous flood of hysterical cries and sobs and gasping mutterings. I tried to catch him, for fear he would die of joy, but he flashed off again, his feet a mist of motion. Then, turning suddenly, he came back in a wild rush and launched himself at my face, almost knocking me down, all the while screeching and screaming and shouting as if saying, "Saved! Saved! Saved at last!" Who could have guessed this dull, enduring little fellow was capable of such passionate emotion? And I couldn't help but cry with him. But there's nothing like hard work for turning down excessive fear or joy. So I ran ahead, calling him gruffly, "Come on, Stickeen, and stop your nonsense, for we have far to go, and it will soon be dark." Neither of us feared another trial like this. Heaven would surely count one enough for a lifetime. The ice ahead was gashed by thousands of crevasses, but they were common ones, and the joy of deliverance burned in us like fire, and we ran without fatigue. Stickeen flew across everything in his way. At last the cloudy mountains came in sight, and we soon felt the solid rock beneath our feet, and were safe. And then came weakness. We tottered down the lateral moraine in the dark, over boulders and tree trunks, through the bushes and devil-club thickets. We reached camp about 10 o'clock, and found a big fire and a big supper, but we were too tired to eat much. I sat by the fire, too exhausted to even speak. Stickeen lay with his chin on my shoe and went to sleep. My first words, some while later, were, "There's a brave doggy." Stickeen opened one eye, wagged his tail, and went back to sleep. Well, in the days that followed, Stickeen was a changed dog. He always lay by my side, tried to keep me constantly in sight, and would take food from no one's hand but mine. I would often catch him gazing up at me with a look of devotion, as if I were his god. And sometimes he would fix my eye with a knowing look, as if to be saying, "Wasn't that an awful time, John, we had together on that glacier?" I have known many dogs, and many a story I could tell of their wisdom and devotion, but to none do I owe so much as I do to Stickeen. At first the least promising and least known of my dog friends, he suddenly became the best known and best loved of them all. Our storm battle for life brought him to light, and through Stickeen, as through a window, I have ever since been looking with deeper sympathy into the hearts of all my fellow mortals. Stickeen's fate is wrapped in mystery, I'm afraid. He disappeared only a few years later. Doubtless he has left this world by now, crossed the last crevasse, and gone to another. But he will not be forgotten. To me, Stickeen is immortal.